Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us here. I'm Vikram Singh. I'm the Vice President for National Security and International Policy here at the Center for American Progress, and we have a really terrific program for you guys this morning, and it's on an issue that I think we would all care deeply about if we knew what was actually going on. We were just talking in the green room about how little public awareness there is of what we're all living through, which is the greatest humanitarian catastrophe basically since World War II. We have more people displaced from their homes by violence or famine than we have had since the end of the Second World War, some 65 million and climbing. I think it's actually above that at this point. 22.5 million refugees, over 20 million people facing famine. These are abstractions. They don't necessarily penetrate the public consciousness. Every now and then we have a breakthrough, a tragic picture like a young Syrian boy washed up on the beach gets through the public consciousness for a little while. Our souls are stirred. We think we want to do more. But for some reason, that has to do with the malaise that's facing a lot of Western countries and democracies right now. Negative news breaks through hard, and it resonates. Fear about what refugees might do, fear of terrorism that is sort of spread rather irrationally through a lot of popular media, is having an impact that's dampening the humanitarian impact. And there's a question, sort of, I think, for countries like the United States, for what our national where our sort of soul as a nation is going to be as we face this greatest humanitarian calamity, and whether we're going to be able to find the political will to do what's best for our own national security and our own interests. These two things actually come together. The budget of the Trump administration that was proposed cuts about 44% from humanitarian assistance. That's not going to be what really happens. Congress isn't going to allow that massive a cut to global humanitarian assistance. But it is truly stark that the world's most important player in protecting refugees is led by a government that is proposing a 44% reduction in what we do to help the most vulnerable people, right as we're in the most dire humanitarian crisis. We're really honored today to have three experts with us who can take us through sort of what the implications are, what the impact will be if the world doesn't take care of the humanitarian challenges we face. The hard thing to do is, as the people here will tell you, we know what to do as an international community and as a nation. We actually have the tools to address a lot of these challenges, and it's a matter of political will and a matter of political leadership whether we're able to do it. Eric Schwartz is with us. Eric Schwartz just became president of Refugees International in June. Congratulations, Eric, and thanks for joining us. Eric spent 3 decades focused on humanitarian and human rights issues. He was the Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration in the Obama administration. I had the pleasure of working with Eric at that time. He was the senior human rights and humanitarian official in the Clinton White House. He was the UN Deputy Special Envoy for Tsunami Recovery after the 2004 Asia tsunami. And prior to arriving at RI, Eric was Dean of the Hubert Humphrey School for Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. And we're grateful to have him with us. Richard Fontaine is president of the Center for New American Security. He was foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain for 5 years, more than 5 years, I think. And he served as an associate director at the National Security Council during the Bush administration. He's also served at the State Department, working for Deputy Secretary Armitage on South Asia issues. And Tori Holt was just very recently Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. So she was responsible for international security and the UN portfolio at the State Department. Prior to that, Tori was an associate at the Stimson Center and co-directed the Future of Peace Operations programs at Stimson. We are really thrilled to have these guys. Hardin Lang, senior fellow here at Center for American Progress, is going to be moderating this discussion. I got the intros out of the way so that they can get right into their talk, and right into your questions at the end of the time. But thank you all for joining us to talk about what should be front page news every single day. Thanks.
Great, Vikram. Thank you very much for getting us started. I think instead of sort of going into traditional opening statements and sort of talking through the sort of different aspects of the crisis, what we should probably do is get directly into questions that help us drill down and understand a sense of priority, like how we sort of think about prioritizing the nature of the problem. Because if you look at the statistics, we're talking about 85 million people here. How do you set priorities in this day and age? And I think I want to start by turning to you, Eric. As Vikram noted in his opening statement, you've been doing this for over 3 decades. You were in the job over as the deputy envoy for the tsunami relief effort. You were the assistant secretary when the Haiti emergency undertook. I mean, all of these things grabbed front page news when we were at that time. What is it when you look at this situation now that makes you so concerned? I mean, you were up on the Hill quite recently briefing, and you told a Senate committee that you have never been more concerned about the humanitarian situation than you are now. Why is that now? Can you sort of walk us through a little bit what the key issues are, and then also how you would be thinking about priorities if you were in your old job?
Thank you, and thank you for hosting this event, and welcome to 2 very distinguished colleagues. Well, first of all, I guess what I should say is, given the state of the world, anyone who's been in leadership positions on humanitarian issues for 3 decades maybe ought to get out of that business, because we're clearly not doing something not right. Well, look, first, the numbers speak for themselves, and I don't need to, but I will repeat some of what Vikram described. I mean, the numbers of displaced in the world are the greatest number, is at the highest level in recorded history. And more than 65 million people around the world are displaced as a result of persecution, conflict, forced out of their homes. Probably 22 million or more are refugees. The rest are within the borders of their country. Dick Holbrooke refused to call them IDPs. He thought that term was too anodyne, and I agree. He called them internal refugees. Vikram used the term 20 million at risk of famine. I'm not going to argue with it. I think the numbers vary. And an awful situation. So in that sense, you could, those numbers by themselves justify the observation the conclusion that I reached in my testimony, that I've never been more concerned about these issues. But frankly, it wasn't the numbers that certainly wasn't the numbers by themselves that motivated my comment. What motivated my comment was that humanitarians know better than anyone else that humanitarian problems do not have humanitarian solutions, right? That's what that's become conventional wisdom. It always has been. When there is no persecution and when there is no conflict, there is no famine. And so what concerns me is, however imperfect the international system has been for addressing political and security issues that give rise to humanitarian suffering, and it has been imperfect. But however imperfect it has been, there's been a recognizable system, and I think it is hard to argue right now that there is a recognizable system with empowered leadership to address not only humanitarian imperatives, but also the political and security issues that give rise to humanitarian suffering. And I won't go on. I think I'll probably used most of the time that you wanted me to use for this answer, so we can get into more details about it. But I would just remark at the remarkable comments of the Secretary General of the United Nations several weeks ago in New York. The specter of a Secretary General of the United Nations standing up at a news conference and imploring, begging the United States to assume a leadership role on world order issues. I don't know how many of you may have seen those statements, but I thought they were, as I said, rather remarkable. And what motivated those statements on his part, I'm convinced, was a belief that without that kind of leadership, these pressing humanitarian crises would just continue. And in my testimony, the two major examples I offered had to do with South Sudan, where so many people are on the brink of famine in that country, and a country that the United States played a major role in promoting an act of self-determination that resulted in a decision on independence. But we have kind of receded, and we've receded well before the advent of the Trump administration. But nonetheless, one example, and the other example I offered was Yemen, which is probably the most dire humanitarian situation the world confronts right now. And the fact that we are not, in a very public way, pressing the Saudis on respect for international humanitarian law is puzzling to me. It's not puzzling to me, it's disheartening for me. So that's why. It has to do with our capacity to deal with the political and security challenges that underlie humanitarian catastrophes.
Do you guys agree with that in terms of the priorities? That it's sort of Yemen and South Sudan are really like the top things here that we need to be focusing on in terms of U.S. leadership in the humanitarian space? Tori?
Go ahead.
Well, I think one of the points Eric makes is so important, which is the humanitarian crisis almost never exists by itself.
Right.
Sure, there are tsunamis, but so many of these famines are directly related to conflict and often even extremism. If you look at what's going on in areas like Yemen, Somalia, the lake in Nigeria with Boko Haram, and also the insecurity spreading up through Libya. We often don't assume that the budget that funds dealing with conflict is related to the humanitarian side, but it's deeply intertwined. And so I can get to this in a minute, but a number of the budget numbers provided by the Trump administration deeply cut into our alliances and coalitions and the multilateral institutions that twin working on the conflict and working on the humanitarian side, particularly some of the UN agencies. World Food Program, the UNICEF budget, for example, has been zeroed out. The budget that provides for diplomacy, political field missions, and peacekeeping has also been drastically cut, and we could get into some of those numbers.
Yeah, I would just add, I think that the near-term priority is the 20 million people at risk of famine this year. So in the four famines in Somalia, Nigeria, Yemen, and South Sudan, you have a problem both of underlying cause and you have a problem of symptom. And right now, you have to go after both. As Eric and everyone's sort of pointing out, famine is not the underlying cause. Famine is the symptom of another cause, and that cause is the conflict that's going on. It's a political phenomenon, and these can be predicted, they can be prevented, and they can be solved once they start. But in the meantime, you've got to treat the symptoms, or otherwise a patient's going to bleed to death. And treating the symptom means you have to have the humanitarian aid in place to save the lives of these people who literally have nothing else this year, and who literally are at risk of starvation or dying from some easily preventable illness that they acquire but can't fend off because of their severe malnutrition. The United States has been disproportionately generous in responding with famine aid already. I think there's probably more to come. But there are other countries that need to step up. The United States can do more, but others should do more as well. And I would love to see the U.S. government, for example, give a modicum of attention to exhorting other countries to step up in the way that they've exhorted our NATO allies to step up and spend 2% of GDP on defense. And we've called for action plans, and we told them if they don't step up more and spend more, then we may moderate our commitment to them, and we've made this a absolutely top priority of our foreign policy. You got 20 million people at risk of starvation this year. That should be a priority as well.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, that's a solvable problem. Eric, just very quickly following up on what a question I had asked before. If you are looking at a world of limited resources, and what we see with the 2018 budget, this huge cut to humanitarian assistance, what we hear from the Hill is that they're sort of doing their own work, right? They're going back to the drawing board and putting together a budget of their own making. But nonetheless, if what we see in what's happened in the House over the last couple of weeks is an indication, there's still going to be some cuts to the humanitarian side of the budget. How would you think about prioritizing if you were in your old job? Is it the famine that's the top priority at this stage? Or is it no one likes to answer these questions. Or, do you start pulling resources from the displacement crisis? How do you think about that?
Nobody does like to answer these questions. So thank you for asking. It's a hard question to answer because, you're talking to, your question caught, there's a high level way to answer it. Mm-hmm. And then I'm thinking about, okay, if I was Assistant Secretary of State, and then I'm dealing with a whole range of bureaucratic realities. And so that's the challenge in sort of answering this question coherently. So let me, and all I'm doing right now is marking time. I think that that you would, and the answer to this is limited because sometimes some accounts you can't transfer some money from some accounts to other accounts. You can't transfer money that's being used for a peacekeeping operation in Cyprus to deal with a famine or food security issues in the DRC. So you're limited. But within that limitation, what I would say is that you would, I think, try to press for the use of funds where the risk of loss of life is the greatest. But if you're working in a U.S. government agency which is working through, as we should work through, multilateral organizations, you'd be pressing hard those organizations to be doing the same thing. But then you'd be dealing with a whole range of operational issues, like, if you're dealing with a famine situation in which you've got Somalia or risk of famine, Somalia and South Sudan, and the Somalia famine is less underfunded than the one in South Sudan, you might make some tactical decisions surrounding that as well. But the basic answer to your question is, of course, you would try to direct resources, to my mind, to the areas of greatest urgency and vulnerability. Having said that, and oftentimes when people say this, they don't mean it, but with all due respect to the point that Richard made, which I think is really important, which is you got to stem, you've got to deal with the crisis. It's a Band-Aid approach, but people need Band-Aids. So acknowledging that point, if I were Assistant Secretary of State today for population, refugees, and migration, I would see one of my major roles as to be pressing the Secretary and pressing the White House on addressing the political and security issues. Humanitarians have to play the role of canaries in the coal mine. And we cannot take the position that we'll deal with the humanitarian suffering and we'll let the diplomats who are focused on political and security issues deal with those issues.
Thank you. So Richard, you wrote an interesting article quite recently about, on the anniversary of the Marshall Plan, taking us back to a moment where the United States really did give a high degree of priority to the use of civilian assistance and economic assistance as a way to pursue national security objectives. If you look at the current situation with the famines, 3 of these are occurring in countries where we have a very significant and active counter-terrorist agenda and priority. And in the fourth, in South Sudan, I mean, it's a country that, as Eric said, we help sort of shepherd into existence. How do you, I mean, in this current landscape, like transfer that linkage that you developed in that article and talk a bit about how the linkage between the use of humanitarian assistance and civilian assistance and our national security plays out in some of these countries?
Well, everybody probably in this room has now heard the famous line from Secretary Jim Mattis when he said something along the lines of, if you don't fully fund the State Department, I need to buy more ammunition. So that's a bit of a shorthand, but there is something I think really to this. You know, sometimes it can be complicated and tenuous to try to draw, you know, cause and effect distinctions between, you know, presence or lack of humanitarian aid and presence or lack of national security threats. But there's sure a lot of circumstantial evidence out there. So stepping back from the countries in which the famines are going on for a second, I mean, if you look at the 4 countries in the Middle East that are currently in civil war, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and Libya, it is not a coincidence that those are all 4 countries host either ISIS, Al-Qaeda, or both, which are obvious threats to the United States. And so the degree to which a country becomes more fragile and more prone to conflict is the same measure by the degree to which it's going to be prone to be a safe haven for terrorists that are ultimately going to be a threat to the United States. Now, it is not always the case that just turning on an aid spigot is going to make them less fragile, less prone to conflict, but it can make a difference. And so I think of humanitarian aid in a way as an insurance policy. It certainly is a moral imperative, but stepping back from the moral side, stepping back from the heart and just using the head for a second. I mean, much of our defense spending, our alliances, these are insurance policies against threats that may or may not ever materialize. And we fund these things and we engage in these things because we think that doing so is ultimately going to be less expensive than dealing with the negative outcomes if we don't do these things. Well, if it's true that humanitarian aid can help fragile states become more resilient, less prone to conflict, and so on, then that is an investment worth making.
Is this what you're hearing when you talk to people on the Hill about some of the concerns that they've had with the 2018 fiscal year budget that the Trump administration put up? Does this national security argument resonate amongst the people who are building the budget, both in the Senate and the House side?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that resonate. One, the national security argument resonates. Two, an argument that sometimes I think we actually shy away from because we want to use these hard-headed, you know, it's all about national security. But America is a great and generous country, and you know, accepting refugees, providing humanitarian aid has very tangible benefits for individuals who otherwise have nothing. And that is something the United States has always been in the business of doing because we're Americans, and we think it's the right thing to do. And that is something that I think does and resonate among elected leaders who can see this, because this is one of the reasons why they came to Washington, is do great things for their country and for the world. And I don't think we should shy away from that argument and just say, well, you know, it's just all about, you know, preventing us from getting our kids blown up in, you know, at home and stuff. I mean, you can overdraw this argument a little bit. So I think that the national security argument sort of resonates. I think the sort of moral and American exceptionalism, American greatness resonates. And then, frankly, the numbers argument resonates because, you know, I mean, every time I've ever heard anybody speak about the politics of humanitarian aid or foreign aid in general, they point out that, you know, Americans think we spend about 15% of the budget, and then they're told, well, it's only 1% or even less, and they say, oh my God, I thought it was, you know, it should be 10 or so, you know, and so people, you know, their constituents oppose foreign aid, but oppose it for the wrong reasons, because they think it's too big. And, you know, those who are involved in the building of these things are aware that this is less than 1% of the budget and is, you know, vanishingly small compared to some of the other line items and things like that. And to the extent to which they see it both as a moral imperative and as an insurance policy against, you know, dangerous destabilization, they think it's an investment worth making.
I mean, it is interesting because if you think back about the example that you use in the article of the Marshall Plan, I mean, obviously there's one that resonates in our national consciousness, you know, continually as having as the value proposition for this sort of aid. But at the same time, I mean, people across administrations, whether it's the current administration or even the Obama administration before, I mean, everyone has been sort of scarred by the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan, where we dumped a tremendous amount of assistance in, civilian assistance in, and it's hard to argue that that really, at the end of the day, helped lock in any sort of real and significant peace and security dividend at this stage in some of these countries. And so, when we started the conversation over a year ago about what was happening in Iraq and how you made progress against the Islamic State, and yet as the military piece sort of fell off as we were making progress, there's very little appetite, even with the last team, to go in and sort of work the stabilization piece of this and to work the reconstruction piece of it. So what is wrong with that? Have we learned the wrong lesson from the experience in Iraq and Afghanistan? Should we be rightly skeptical of some of the civilian assistance and those models in this day and age? Or how do we think about it in a new way?
Well, I don't really agree that it was all the civilian assistance in Iraq and Afghanistan was squandered. I think that, it took us years and years to get to an effective counterinsurgency strategy in Iraq. We have stumbled trying to get to something like that in Afghanistan and never really cracked the code. But if you look at Iraq, we didn't do sort of clear hold build and put the emphasis on the build after the security was put in place, and the build is the civilian assistance side of things. When we finally did, starting in the beginning of 2007, there were rapid and dramatic gains, a fall of 90% in violence between the beginning of 2007 and the end of 2007. And by the end of, by 2011, you had a flawed but functioning government in Iraq, and you had, not, maybe the world's most attractive sort of polity there, but you had basically a country that was more or less stable. It certainly wasn't, a gigantic sanctuary for ISIS and all these other things. It was a complete withdrawal of our military forces that squandered those gains, and so, there's a couple lessons here. One is you've got to have the security in place, and you've got to have the political influence over, the governments. Otherwise, they start to, do things that are going to squander what you've done. But the civilian piece of this remains important. I think the big danger right now, for example, in Iraq is we have gotten to the point in Iraq where the military campaign is actually very effective. I mean, Mosul has been liberated, but it looks like Dresden, right? And so, same in cities in Anbar and all this other stuff. So we have gotten to the point, because the military campaign has been intensified, through the last year, the Obama administration, through the Trump administration. It is a matter of time before ISIS is going to get squeezed out of almost everywhere. But if you don't have the civilian side to come behind it, you're going to be just whack-a-moling forever, because you're not dealing with the underlying stuff. Now, there are limits to what the U.S. can do, but what the U.S. can do is not nothing.
Agreed. And that sort of brings us to what other folks can do besides the United States. And Tori, I mean, this is, for like the last over 7 years, you spent a tremendous amount of time sort of figuring out how we leverage multilateral institutions to share the burden with us in many of these situations. And one of the parts of the budget that's been particularly hard hit with the 2018 is the United Nations piece of this. I mean, the multilateral piece of it. I mean, as you said in your opening remarks, a number of institutions on the voluntary side of the contribution ledger are being zeroed out. Could you walk us through, again, we probably shouldn't take 2018 FY budget as the Bible, but what are the implications for some of these multilateral institutions that you spent all this time sort of building and supporting, particularly in the humanitarian space?
Well, thanks very much. I mean, over multiple administrations, in general, the U.S. government looks to partner with other countries, alliances, and coalitions, and the UN is part of that. And I think the rise in the refugee and displacement crisis, the spread of extremism, the number of conflicts in the world, which grew over the last few years, meant that we turned time and again to try and improve the game and the effective practical delivery of diplomacy, of capability, of conflict prevention and relief to civilians around the world. And often that was through the Security Council. So I'll just say one thing. I mean, the United States in general, we as Americans just take this for granted. You vote in the Security Council for a sanctions regime, someone will implement it. You vote for a peacekeeping mission, those people will pitch up, the helicopters will arrive. You want to have a new negotiation, some diplomat will fly overseas, or you'll set up a field operation. And in my old job, I realized, no, you're just starting that process. Every one of those actions requires pressure, diplomacy, useful criticism, and lift up the expectations of what can be delivered in the field. So what the concern might be about the current proposed budget, let me point to two lines. One, something called the contributions to international organizations. The budget cuts that by 30%. This is 44 organizations. This is NATO. This is the Organization for Prevention and Prohibition on Chemical Weapons. It's the inspection agency that looks at nuclear materials. It's the World Health Organization that goes after and tries to stop Zika and Ebola from coming to the United States. And then a whole list of others, including the UN regular budget. Well, that sounds really boring, UN regular budget. But what is it? Those are the field operations. In Afghanistan, it's UNAMA doing diplomatic work all over the country. In Iraq, it's also a field operation. It's a field operation in Libya. It's a diplomacy effort in Yemen. It's aiming for peace in Colombia after 40 years of conflict. It's also operating in places that Americans don't pay attention to, whether it's Burundi or some other part of that continent. And if you're going to try and get 30% out of basically the request for that, they've gone from roughly 1.4 billion to 1 billion. Either you're going to get rid of NATO, World Health Organization, unlikely. You're going to nibble everything on that list to death, including the Civil Aviation Organization, or you're going to hit the UN. And I think actually what we need to have a conversation with Congress about is so much of what the UN does is deep on the national security, and it's twinned with these humanitarian enterprises. One other budget, the peacekeeping budget. It's large. It's grown over the number of last few years for places like Mali, where extremists in the north linked up through the whole Sahel region. After the French intervention, the UN sent in a peacekeeping mission to try and stabilize the region and also stem the flow of refugees. That's a large mission. It costs a lot. So does South Sudan, where the peacekeeping operation today hosts over 200,000 civilians in UN compounds. Congo's another one, Darfur, Central African Republic. Even with missions winding down in Liberia, Haiti, Cote d'Ivoire, and rightful cuts to the mission likely in Darfur, there's no way you can cut that budget by 50%. And the US pays the most. One last point. These organizations, these 44 organizations, as well as our peacekeeping dues, are all negotiated assessment rates in advance. These are not voluntary contributions. So if the US comes in with a budget less than what we've agreed to pay in advance, we go into arrears, and the organization has less resources. The smart thing to do would be go back to the organization, either renegotiate your assessment rate, reduce the budget, and frankly come up with a strategy to articulate the reforms that the US seeks and use that process to do that. But where we are today is we have budget cuts before a strategy.
But practically, what would it mean for the humanitarian? I mean, I think a lot of people in the US sometimes forget how much of a international humanitarian relief and response occurs through the United Nations when it goes out and sort of in a leadership role, both through through OCHA, but also through some of the line agencies like UNICEF, et cetera. I mean, are any of these agencies in essence sort of on the chopping block? And what would the impact be for the humanitarian response in some of these key countries that Eric was talking about?
Well, I'll say something brief, but this is Eric's area of expertise. One other account is voluntary contributions. They got zeroed out by the administration's budget proposal. So nothing for UNICEF. I don't know where World Food Program is, but I couldn't find it in the State Department budget either. These are two of the premier aid agencies that deliver. UNHCR is a different line, and Eric can speak to that. But basically, one of the higher functioning capabilities of the UN is the humanitarian, both coordination role, as you point out, delivery of resources, and collaboration and getting countries around the world to work together, whether it's dealing with Syrian refugees that have flowed into Jordan and Lebanon or over the border from South Sudan. But I think Eric would know the budget numbers.
Why don't I comment on a couple of Tori's comments and a couple of Rich's, and then I'll very briefly. Well, the other point that Tori didn't make was that if we come in with these cuts, it's not as though we're operating in a vacuum or by ourselves. Other governments are going to also expect reductions in their contributions, so it will have a snowball effect. Now that was I saw the Secretary General the other day in New York, and that was a point that he made. And then on the World Food Program and Food for Peace, our Title II Food for Peace program, funded probably in recent years on the order of about $2 billion, between $1.5 and $2 billion, was zeroed out. So that's your World Food Program contribution. Now, the administration has said that, well, we're going to fund food assistance through another account, the International Disaster Assistance Account. And actually, that's not an awful idea, because if you fund that through cash, it becomes a more flexible resource. But they didn't put any money into it. They didn't share. So there's no money there. It's that other account has no increase, essentially. And so that's the challenge. That's the problem. I just want to make a couple comments on Richard's points on this issue of lessons of the past. We always mislearn lessons of the past, right? I mean, yeah, some of the ambitions and some of the mistakes and some of our beliefs that we could basically remake societies and do it with people who are fundamentally unqualified to do it in Iraq. I mean, that was an awful experience. But if the takeaway from that experience is, once we end our military engagement, our job is done, then that's a dramatically dangerous lesson to be learned from such an experience. I mean, if we're going to be engaged in military operations, in security engagements in other parts of the world, then we have to think about what our responsibilities after the fall might be. And that's not an invitation to do stupid things, but it does create an imperative for continued engagement. And then the only other comment I wanted to make on Richard's comments were on the moral imperative for U.S. aid, for U.S. assistance. When I was Assistant Secretary of State for refugees, that was what the appropriators cared about. We were the only bureau in the Department of State that would regularly come in with a request that the appropriators would increase. And I think it was largely based on the moral imperative. But the two other issues that I think are important, in addition to the security rationale that Richard articulated, was I think there is at the risk of being accused of a liberal internationalist, of being a liberal internationalist, I think there really is a foreign policy and national security benefit from global leadership on these issues and the perception among our allies that we are leaders and international good citizens. I think that gives us capital, political capital, for other objectives that we seek in the international community. I think that's really important as well. And then another objective, I think, is keeping faith with vulnerable communities around the world who are not unaware of the role of the United States. And I think that has foreign policy benefits as well.
Tori, you just sort of walked through very briefly a series of different peacekeeping missions. Link that back to the humanitarian situation. I mean, many people sort of look at the peacekeeping budget and the presence of UN peacekeepers, and they have some questions about whether or not, how much good this is doing in different places. But the way I understood you to couch this is that if we're going to get into, if the current levels hold, the trade space is basically going to be a decision about one of these large missions going away. And if you look at the countries you outlined, we as the United States have either a national security or a huge humanitarian interest in either of these, in any of these places. So what's really the sort of dilemma that's going to be facing the United Nations if this goes through?
Right. Well, thanks very much. No, you've captured it well. There's roughly 16 peacekeeping operations. The 5 big ones all are dealing both with humanitarian crises and in some cases trying to prevent a much wider war, such as in the Great Lakes Congo region, which has been the site of some of the greatest civilian deaths over the last 15 years. In South Sudan, the new country that was birthed in 2011 went into civil strife in December 2013, and today it has deep insecurity, and I think it's one of the largest new refugee crises spreading into Uganda and destabilizing the whole region. I mentioned Mali already. If you look at a map of Western Africa up through Libya and the Sahel, that feeds right into the migration challenge and the IDP issue that's facing Europe. So each of these has their own story. I would add to that the Central African Republic, and I know Ambassador Haley has been focused on this, where there's really good signs, a beginning of governance in a country where the whole population was destabilized by civilian conflict and desperate poverty. And each of these also, and I want to link it back to Iraq, has a humanitarian link, because if you can create a civilian-led governance system with rule of law and stabilize a country, people can return home. They can plant their fields. They will look forward to justice at a localized level. And that is the long-term goal of each of these operations, is to help the country stand up and depart, as they are doing today in Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, and Haiti, which we don't even think about because they're basically at peace. I also want to mention another aspect that links what Richard was saying about Iraq and Afghanistan and these UN field operations. One of the reforms of the last few years is to emphasize not just either you send in the military or you send in the humanitarians, but you try and create security for the civilian population, protection of civilians. In Iraq, for example, it was actually a woman from the U.S. who works for the UN who was coordinating with the Iraqi military and the American military going into Fallujah to try and figure out how to get as many people out of harm's way and on the right side in advance of both of those military operations. And so it's a bit more sophisticated than we might think at times, the role of the international organizations on clear humanitarian and security. Other elements of the budget which would be cut include women and men who are dealing with sexual violence and conflict. There's been a whole campaign to root that out and call governments onto the carpet when they don't prevent it by their own forces. That would go away. We're trying to get kids out of being child soldiers. We're trying to prevent human trafficking and torture. So these are all related to the humanitarian enterprise, but come back to the security efforts that the multilateral organizations often support when they go to the field.
I love the way Tori was talking in the passive voice about protection of civilians, when there's probably nobody in this country who is more responsible for strengthening American support for this area in an intelligent and informed way than Tori Holt. So,
Richard, I mean, one of the things that we hear a lot, there was a lot of hand-wringing in May when the budget came out about what it would mean. A lot of the discussion that we've had here refer back to those numbers in terms of the cuts that were called for. We've seen some activity in the House over the last couple of weeks where they've begun the process of sort of marking up and adjusting their own budget. We heard a lot from sort of large figures in the Senate about how, in essence, this budget was DOA when it arrived. So can you sort of just where are we right now in terms of the budget discussions and what's happening on the Hill to try to address some of the concerns that we've raised? And how focused do we need to be on the game on the Hill as we move into September?
Well, I think the game on the Hill is right now the only game in town. By submitting to the Congress a budget that cuts so drastically foreign assistance and the State Department, at least in the Senate, and I think also to a large degree in the House, it really was sort of dead on arrival. So what did this mean in practice? Well, it meant that it was not typically the Congress takes up the president's budget and they use it as the blueprint, and that's the baseline from which they increase this or decrease that or sort of change things around. And this time that didn't happen because it was such a draconian cut, and because it was not pursuant to sort of a overall policy look at the value or the demerits of any particular set of programs or activities. It was more of kind of the meat cleaver approach to just getting those numbers down. And so we'll cut this and we'll reduce this and we'll cut this and we'll reduce this without a whole lot of underlying justification for this. And so essentially what the Congress has done is use last year's appropriations bills as the baseline and started to work from there. So I think you guys were telling me before, I guess the House cut is what, 16% or something like that. Not 38%, but 16% is still pretty big. I think the Senate is probably going to come in at a couple of percentage points, and then appropriators get together and cut the baby in half, and you start to dollars are infinitely negotiable, so you start to come out somewhere in the middle. So I think you're likely to see a reduction, but you're not going to see a reduction anything like what the administration has proposed. Part of the problem with, I think, the process here is because of the way the budget was submitted. You don't have the kind of analytical partner that you would have, I think, in the administration that the Congress usually wants. I mean, the Congress, I say this with utter affection for my, where I spent years of my life working. I mean, staffers, nobody's more important and smarter than a Senate staffer. But there's only a few of these folks, and the senators, of course, are all wise as well. But there's only a few of these folks working on this stuff, and they don't know the granular trade-offs associated with a dollar here, a dollar there, and so they rely on the executive branch. And when the stated executive branch position is cut, then it takes them out of that conversation in a way that I think is going to have implications for the sort of underlying sort of resilience and appropriateness of what they come up with. So I think the real question is, was this kind of a first year right out of the gates? We'll send out a budget and send it up to the Hill that we know they're going to monkey around with anyway, and next year we sort of go through a much more regular process and all this other stuff, or not, and that just remains to be seen.
Eric, when you look at what's going on the Hill, what are the concerns that you're flagging in terms of what the political game is that needs to be played to get some of these accounts back to where you would feel more comfortable over the next couple of months?
Well, first of all, I suspect, and I think Richard probably would agree with this, there are probably many phone conversations taking place right now between, and email exchanges between congressional staff and director level people in the agencies along the lines of, what do you guys really need?
Meetings in parking lots in the dead of night to exchange information.
But yeah, I mean, what I said at the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee is what I'll repeat here is, I think of a 5 to 10% cut is a hell of a lot better than a 44% cut. But my fear is it's not guided by any strategic discussion, and I don't think splitting the difference, although you're splitting the difference on the high side, is the way to make policy, especially when when foreign humanitarian needs are expanding so significantly. I think we're pretty much where we ought to be as a nation in terms of international humanitarian assistance. We're probably it's roughly equivalent to our percentage of world GDP. Now, because our percentage of world GDP has been going down, maybe we're a little bit higher than that, but I think I can live with that, and I think we should be able to live with that on the humanitarian assistance side, especially since we're so low on the development assistance side. Compared to other northern countries. So I think we're about right, and so for my money, I mean, practically speaking, my biggest fear is that there will be any cuts, and I suspect there may be, but I don't think there should be. For my money, I think we should be thinking about, as needs expand, we should be thinking about what more can we do in circumstances where humanitarian assistance is still way below 1% of the federal budget. So to answer your question directly, those are the points I'm making to folks on the Hill.
But we're still lacking a strategy.
That's
I think
exactly
one of the
right.
challenges is that the administration came in with a budget proposal, and that dialogue, whether it's in a parking lot or by phones with agencies, needs to have a frame. What is the goal that this budget reflects? And let's have it out, because that's a national conversation. It's one that we should be having in the public and with Congress and with the administration. And there are professionals all through government who are looking for guidance on how to make choices on this. So, maybe you've described the sandwich we'll end up with a percentage cut, but that says nothing about where the United States is headed. And if this government does not want to be the world's policeman, then the whole game is getting others to do more. And if we start pulling back, they're going to do less, or they'll do more of things we don't like. We are opening up space for governments who do not share our interest to play on the international stage and direct traffic. So I would hope that members of Congress would take it very seriously, and that before any major cuts are made, there be a review. Maybe punt for a year, stick to the 17 budget, have a vigorous conversation, let the federal employees take their jobs. We still have plenty of people not appointed at the State Department, and have that conversation, which would be greatly welcome. Otherwise, we're going to be walking into all kinds of agencies around the world saying we want to spend less, and we can't tell you why.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Well, if I could just make one more point about the politics of all this. I mean, one thing that I observed in my time on the Hill and since then is the development community, and to a lesser extent the sort of humanitarian aid community, focuses a whole lot on inputs. What is the budget? How many dollars? How are you going to spend it? What programs? All these other things. And this year is a bit of a, in case of emergency, break glass situation because of, you don't get outcomes unless you have inputs. But I think that in a normal year, that actually reverses the arguments that need to be made. I think people on the Hill and maybe even just average Americans, they care about outcomes. I mean, you can argue with them, well, you know, it's only a little bit less than 1% of the federal budget, but they don't know how big the federal budget is anyway, and all this other stuff. But I mean, you know, going back to PEPFAR, I mean, I remember back in the Bush administration, the idea a Republican administration was suddenly going to decide to spend billions of taxpayer dollars to fund antiretroviral treatments for Africans was, you know, not exactly intuitive. And, you know, they ultimately, I think the most successful arguments were neither kind of, you know, well, in the grand scheme of things, these billions are not that much if you look at how much we owe Social Security Trust Fund or, you know, how much we spend on defense, nor was it really, well, you know, if we don't fund antiretroviral treatments, so many people will get AIDS in these countries, they'll be destabilized and they'll become sanctuaries for terrorists, and then, you know, Swaziland will become a direct threat to the United States. It was, look, we can save millions of people will be alive because of what you have done. Ultimately acceptable cost to the United States, but that's an outcome. And I think it was the outcome that was most compelling to people and has remained so. And so again, this year is different, right? But in general, I think, you know, we've got to sort of flip this from a discussion about, you know, let's fight over what the inputs are going to be to what kind of outcomes are we going to be able to achieve with these inputs. And if we don't inject the dollars this year, what kind of outcomes are we going to leave on the table, right? I mean, people will die if we don't fund food aid. I mean, it's just the bottom line. So that's the kind of thing I think we should be aware of.
I think that's a great that's a great point. I wanted to make a different a point on a different issue, which is, you know, I think we're talking a lot about the Congress, and I know, for example, Richard's former boss, John McCain, has made it a point to go out to the rest of the world and say, look, you know, I want to communicate to you what we're about, what our commitments really are. And I think engagement with the Congress is really important. But there is a role that the administration plays that is irreplaceable. And it has to do with priority setting and strategy. There's no getting around it. And so as a practical matter, for those who are involved in advocacy broadly defined, I think it means sustaining engagement with the administration, with those at senior levels who are receptive to these messages and are working to develop the kind of strategic approaches which really are critical.
Okay, I think with that, maybe we should open this up to some questions from the audience. Just before we get started, please, when you ask a question, sort of identify the organization that you're from, and let's try to keep it to a question and less of a statement. So, right here in the pink shirt.
My name is Mike. I work for International Medical Corps. I oversee the East Africa region. Thanks a lot for the really fruitful discussion. My question is a little bit on the increased scrutiny that humanitarian actors are finding ourselves. And, you know, with the 4 famines as conflict as the precursor, we can't access a lot of these areas. Yeah. So how much of that does that play in? If 990 million was pumped in tomorrow, could we conceivably reach those people in IPC4, IPC5 areas? I doubt it. And how much of that would then increase the global scrutiny on humanitarian actors? Are we set up to fail without the diplomacy lens featuring alongside? How much of that is understood by kind of the higher echelons? I understand framing it from the defense perspective, which is great, but we're at a crossroads really, and you know, a lot of the people that we're trying to access in these areas are not getting the help they need, and they're occupied by extremists. So the funding that we, you know, as the U.S. administration give to AFRICOM, for example, the Saudis, you know, the proxies that could exert influence, how much of that does that play a part?
I'll take a quick stab at that. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, South Sudan is a perfect example of this. I mean, what is it, 30 humanitarian workers already this year have been killed delivering aid, and the number is, I think, well above 100 over the course of the last couple of years. It is not a in some areas, not a permissive environment in which to deliver aid. So I think there's a couple of things that stem from that. One, is, there's sort of the grand diplomacy, let's resolve these conflicts, let's get everybody to stop fighting, but there's the intermediate diplomacy of getting access to humanitarian workers, and that is the acute phase of the diplomacy, and that's where you have to be aiming today. In parallel, you're aiming over the medium to longer term at let's resolve these conflicts, but that's hard, right? It should be easier, and we have done this in the past, to be able to get humanitarian aid in by through diplomacy, persuading the parties to allow this to happen. The other thing is, I think there's some creative experimental aid delivery ways. Drone delivery and things like that we should really be exploring. Those who make drones for the U.S. military attest that these things can be used to effectively deliver aid in impermissive places in Syria or other conflict zones and things like that. I don't know whether they're right, but let's give it a try.
Eric, are we setting up the humanitarians to fail? There was a huge effort on the $990 million. First it got approved, and then it sat in OMB for quite some time, and now it's out there and being delivered to the NGOs. But if they're facing this challenge of access, which I think is something you also highlighted in your testimony, who in the U.S. government right now is responsible for this, and who should be pushing on this?
Who's responsible, Eric?
It's first of all, it depends on how you define fail. I don't think that if you define fail in terms of an inability to get to people who are inaccessible, then yeah, you're going to fail. But no, that issue concerns me a little bit less. I don't think within government, and frankly, I don't know, but I would suspect not in the general public either, but not within government. I don't think humanitarians are held responsible for a failure to get into inaccessible areas. I just don't. But I do think, look, this issue, I don't think I spent more time on any issue when I was Assistant Secretary of State for Refugees than I spent on trying to figure out how to get around OFAC rules related. Well, whoever's listening, I don't mean get around OFAC rules, but how to work through OFAC rules in getting assistance to Somalia, and when there was so many areas that were were subject to Al-Shabaab control. And ultimately we negotiated an arrangement with some UN organization, the ICRC and UNHCR, we came up with a workable solution which was consistent with U.S. law. But those problems really existed. It's interesting, we haven't heard as much about those challenges in the current crisis as I experienced in 2011, but there's an article in this morning, that's why I was looking at my smartphone, about this problem in Al-Shabaab controlled areas of Somalia, and I would refer that article to you because I think it's from The Independent, I'm not certain of that. And I think it's a real difficult issue. So what's my bottom line? My bottom line is that number one, I think this is an area where diplomacy and pressure can make a huge difference. Whether it's encouraging the government of Nigeria in terms of inaccessible areas in the Northeast, pushing and pressing the Saudis in ways that we haven't yet in terms of respect for international humanitarian law in Yemen. So I think this is an area where humanitarians have to press diplomats hard. Secondly, I think we have to ask and answer the question of whether we're prepared to permit assistance into a rebel-held territory with an understanding that there will be some, quote, leakage. And I think the answer to that question has to be yes, as a matter of policy. The question is how much, and how do you manage that issue? But I think, to my mind, if you're not prepared to accept the principle that could happen, then you're going to consign people to terrible suffering and death. But of course, there are limitations to how much policymakers will permit that to happen. But that's a conversation that has to happen. It's a conversation that has to happen between people who are concerned about security issues and people who are concerned about humanitarian issues.
Next question. Right here in the front.
Ahmed from Internews. Just because I was living in the Middle East, and sometimes I see some of the area where they're getting assistance from the international organization, that they depend too much on providing the food for today, to eat today, and then tomorrow what will happen. So my question, what will happen, is there is the international organization also have their priority to divide the money between the daily meal and some sustainable project to keep them in the future if something happen. And if I can make a quick comment, because this year I see the situation in the state here, and I think the international organization has to have a different public affairs policy, because Americans themselves are now 25 million of Americans are going to lose their medical coverage. So if you say 20 million are going to die, I don't think they're focusing on their own problem. Otherwise, you have to relay the message to them in concrete message so they can understand what's really happening in the world. Thank you.
So, I mean, basically a question about, sort of the nexus between humanitarian assistance and development assistance. I mean, this sort of bridging of the two, which has been sort of at the heart of much of the international conversation in summitry over the last 2 years around the humanitarian space. Who wants to, Tori, do you want to jump in on that?
I mean, there's a whole continuum. The humanitarian aid is often emergency relief, but you're right to point out that long term it needs to be sustainable. And so the other accounts, like the UN Development Program, that tries to create those environments, or food resilience, which Eric could probably speak to, or Richard, tries to create systems where people are not in that emergency situation. But if you really push it, and this goes to the other speaker, you also need accountability for bad actors. I mean, that's not exactly what you're saying, but if people steal food, or if they attack aid workers and nothing happens, then they have impunity. And it teaches them that that's okay, which then further undercuts the situation, whether it's emergency relief or development long time. Corruption's another problem. So you have a whole sort of frame that we've been used to operating in, from emergency development into security and long-term resilience. And every element of that is challenged by this budget proposal, I'm sorry to say. But others are maybe, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, there's some obvious ways that you chip away at this. I mean, one is monetizing food aid, right? Instead of, buying it in the United States from American farmers, putting on an American flag shipping company's vessel, and then sailing it over and then dumping it on the local market to depress the value of the, products that the farmers locally are trying to sell. I mean, it doesn't make any sense for anybody other than the farmers and the shipping company in the United States. This has been politically almost impossible, but when you have an acute shortage, you got to give plumpy nut out and things like that. But we're talking about sort of getting from one step to the next to the next. I mean, monetizing food aid will stimulate the markets there and put dollars in the hands of farmers at the local level, and that can allow them to invest more and things like that. So and it also doesn't dilute the value of your investment the way it does when we do it currently the way we do it. But if you've got a political solution to how to get that done in the United States, then there's probably a long list of other things that we should aim for. So.
Well, that was the Trump budget proposal, which eliminated Title II, but I don't think...
Well, that's one way.
But...
that's like saying if you have a headache, cut your head off and you don't have a headache anymore.
Right, I was making a joke. I guess not a good one in this context. Let me just comment on your question. I think the two obstacles that, the idea of building local capacity begins in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. I think it's, we did a study in 2005 in the Office of the Tsunami Recovery, and the IRC did a study on local capacity, and their conclusion was, of course, it's critical, you have to do that. The two obstacles to doing that are, number one, sometimes all hell is breaking loose and you just can't do it. I mean, you're in a real crisis situation, and people's, you don't have, you're in conflict, you're in an environment where basically all you can do is get essential assistance. So that's one obstacle. The other obstacle is governments. If you're talking about refugees, for example, who are outside their country of origin, traditionally governments have been very reluctant. Governments who are hosting refugees have been willing to do so based on the fiction that these people are only going to be there for a very short period of time. So the more the assistance is designed to give them the wherewithal to succeed over time, the more that that challenges the fiction that people are only going to be there for a short amount of time. Happily, I think some of those perceptions are changing. In large measure, frankly, as a result of the Leaders' Summit on Refugees convened by the United States and other governments in September of 2016. And we see governments like the government of Uganda, for example, which doesn't have a perfect record on humanitarian issues by any means, but they are, talking about providing education opportunities for refugees, employment opportunities for refugees, and building in to a frame that was usually just emergency assistance into that frame more longer-term development objectives.
Yeah, I mean, and also we see some exciting things beginning to happen in countries like Jordan, where the conversation has been much more. I mean, a couple of things. One, you see assistance being handed out not just in items but in cash, right? So UNHCR now has and WFP have a very sophisticated system where you allocate a certain amount of funds to an individual's account, and that individual account has a card, and they go and sort of look. They have an iris scan at the ATM and are able to take out the money and basically make decisions about how they prioritize in their life going forward on the recipient side. In addition, the conversation about jobs and the need to get jobs for people who are in displacement. And as we know now, 50% of people in displacement are going to be in displacement for 5, 10, 15 years. That the need to help make them self-sustainable is now at a top priority. We have the World Bank, who's now entered into this conversation in a very serious and significant way. It's not yet translating itself into the kind of results we need to see on the ground yet, but it's now a given that they need to be part of that conversation. Did we have other questions? Sir, yes, in blue in the back.
I thank you for such a fruitful discussion. My name is Sarah Williamson, and I'm the director of Protect the People, which works on protection of civilians, and I'm really happy to hear all the panelists. But my question is really for Richard. And since I was also a staffer for a Republican senator, I'm just wondering if we can separate our work with the Trump administration from our work with the Republican Party and other Republican members on the Hill, and also Republican elected officials such as governors and mayors and others who strongly believe in the humanitarian and moral arguments. I mean, what more can we be doing as a community with Republicans?
Well, I mean, if you look on the Hill at those who've been some of the most vociferous supporters of foreign aid in general, I mean, Lindsey Graham, Republican, good Republican, is at the, probably at the top of the list right now. So I don't think that it's certainly not an undifferentiated Republican position to be sort of anti-foreign aid or anti-humanitarian assistance or anti-development assistance for that matter, or any of these other things. I think awareness, not just among Republicans, but among people in general, is a big part of this. I mean, it's really a credit to CAP for doing this panel, but how many other panels like this are going on in Washington relative to panels about all the other important issues like Russia and Iran and North Korea and all these other things? Those are worthy things, but in a lot of ways, some of the stuff we're discussing, particularly the 4 famines and plus, the displaced, the millions of displaced people, it's kind of the biggest story that very few people are paying attention to. The International Rescue Committee recently had a poll that was pretty interesting, and it asked Americans how many people know that famine is going on in the world, and the answer was 15%. Much less, obviously, than other sort of international crises. You ask them how much they know North Korea is getting out of hand, it's very high. And you ask them where their famine prevention or dealing with famine sort of comes in their list of priorities, it's nowhere. But when you tell them that 20 million people are at risk of famine this year, it immediately goes into the top 5 priorities of almost everybody who answers the poll. And among millennials, 75% of it put as the number 1. So, there is an awareness aspect to this that, I think it's a product of the fact that, in the United States and in other countries as well, I mean, there's a whole lot of domestic politics going on right now. And so that crowds out a lot of our attention. The world, there's a whole lot of crises going on. I mean, you can't even count on 2 hands all of the sort of hot spots around the world. And so you have to fight for these 2 crises, the migration displaced crisis and the famine crisis, to get attention amid this sort of cacophony of other things. But once people do focus on it, they tend to care about it for pretty obvious human reasons. And I don't think that really has much to do with whether Republican or Democrat or whatever else, but it can generate some will.
That's great. Do we have any other questions? So on this side here.
Hi, my name is David Lang, and I'm with the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training. I was wondering if you guys could consider the role of the Peace Corps for a second, and what you think will happen to it throughout the Trump era. If you think it's effective, if you think it's efficient, and how you think it can evolve going forward.
Question.
Silence.
I think that's a Tory question.
Well, as a former State Department person, I guess
Yeah,
I can only say, I mean, Peace Corps seems to have had broad support. I don't know where it stands in the budget, but I would be surprised if the Hill wouldn't restore it. It's often the way that other countries experience Americans, and it brings back trained Americans who have been engaged in the world and populate our country both domestically and internationally in really successful ways. But I'm sorry, I don't know the budget numbers at all.
Yeah, Tori does make a great point. Perhaps the greatest benefit of the Peace Corps is, so many former Peace Corps volunteers are doing critically important work in global public life right now, often for the United States and U.S. non-governmental organizations.
But I remember there was one crisis, and the Security Council was moving very quickly to try and set something up. And I got a call from a guy in town. He's like, I was Peace Corps in this remote location of this country, and I still speak the local language. I'm happy to fly in if you need help. I mean, the language skills, the fluency, it's all important. And Harden, you're probably going to wrap up. I just want to say, I think so much of this conversation, Richard, you're pointing out, and Sarah's question, we are very focused on our domestic conversation right now. And embedded in that is an assumption that the U.S. leads no matter what. That we are engaged, not only our embassies around the world, but that we lead most international organizations, not just NATO and the United Nations and the Weights and Measures Association, ICAO, but that we are the big player at every table. And the fear I have about this budget is that we are not debating it, and that the implications may take us away from the table or put us at a table without an explanation of what we are seeking. And it's not even wrong to seek something different. I think it would be refreshing. There's a large reform agenda we should be going after, but this budget does not enable America to engage in the way we're used to engaging. And the humanitarian side is one of the most clear elements of that. So thank you for hosting us on this conversation.
No, thank you very much. I mean, just as we close up, the one thing I would say is this is such a sort of a difficult, it's not an easy conversation to have and to walk out with a sense of optimism, given that we're talking about 65 million people plus displaced, there's 22 plus people at risk or beginning to experience famine. And then also looking at where the budget is at the moment. There's a sense that maybe U.S. leadership really is in question on some of the space. But then at the same time, as Richard says, there really is an essence of a bipartisan sort of consensus up on the Hill that this still does matter. And right now, they have so far held the line, and it's a place to look to continue to sort of focus our sense of optimism about what American leadership could mean. And in addition, the really important point about trying to get the word out and having an echo and amplifying this conversation, whether it's amongst millennials or people outside of Washington, who, if it's framed for them correctly, they do care. And this does become a big priority for them. And this is something that when other countries look at us and their populations look at us, this is what they have seen in the past and what will be incredibly important for them to continue to see in the future. And with that, I just want to give our panel a big hand. Thank you very much for coming on today.